Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 7investing.com podcast. Our mission at 7investing is to empower you to invest in your future. We do that by providing a ton of free educational content like this podcast and by offering a monthly subscription service where our team of advisors provides our 7 best ideas in the stock market each month for just $17. If you are a somewhat regular listener to this podcast, you know that we mostly talk about investing in the financial sense and investing in things like public companies. And we've even talked about venture capital, but our families and specifically our kids are another area where I believe it's very important to invest. And so almost out of my own desire, I reached out to Jessica Lahey and asked her to be a guest on the podcast because Jessica, I can't think of a better person, at least not anybody that I follow or that I know, than you to talk about this. So I'm going to introduce you real quick, and then I would love for you to say hello to everybody. Jessica is a teacher, a writer, and a mom. Over 20 years, she has taught every grade from 6th to 12th in both public and private schools. She writes a lot, and she writes about education, parenting, and child welfare for The Atlantic, Vermont Public Radio, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. And she's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Gift of Failure, which for anybody watching the YouTube video, I have it here and she has it behind her. And the tagline is how the best parents learn to let go so their children can succeed. She's a member of the Amazon Studios Thought Leaderboard and wrote the education curriculum for Amazon Kids, The Stinky and Dirty Show. We love that show in our house, Jessica.
Good.
There's some more stuff in the bio, but the last thing I want to hit on for your bio is that you have a second book coming out, The Addiction Innoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence, which will be released in April of 2021. So Jessica, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I love talking about kids. We're all kind of isolated right now. And so having the opportunity to, do a little bit of teaching and do a little bit of talking about what's great for kids makes me really happy.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm excited. So I'd love to start. I watched a keynote of yours and you talked about how you had your life planned out when you were 25 years old in law school.
Don't we all, 20-year-olds, 20 to 30, we're pretty sure we have it all figured out.
I have everything figured out. I don't know what, no, I'm totally kidding. But then a different opportunity came up and you decided to take an opportunity to teach gifted kids in middle school. So why would somebody that was on track to be a lawyer and probably make a lot of money, why would you decide to start teaching? My mom's a teacher, so I know what that life is like. So why did you make that decision to go for teaching?
Well, first, let's take the finances out of it because I was going to be working on the local level in juvenile court. So I was not going to be making a lot of money. I was in law school to work with kids. I had a job I had all scoped out. I had a mentor. She was becoming a judge. She was moving away from the juvenile court. I was hoping to take her place as the assistant district attorney in juvenile court. And, I was asked to teach by someone, a teacher of mine, my legal writing professor, asked me about whether I'd be interested in teaching a course over at the Duke Talent Identification Program. And at first I said no, because I was on track to graduate early from law school by going to school in the summer. And I was pregnant at the time. So I really did need to graduate early. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I did it. And I came home after that first day of teaching and I just knew I was positive. In fact, it was so clear that I knew I was going to be a teacher that my husband just saw it on my face. And he, the joke I always make about this is he looked at me and he said, "Are you even going to finish law school?" I was radiating. I was just glowing. And it wasn't just that I was pregnant. So it was a really important moment for me. I was sort of becoming a mom and becoming a teacher in the same year. And that confluence has really dictated much of what I've done with my career and my writing life.
Yeah. And I think with your career and with a lot of careers, kind of like we were teasing about earlier, we feel like we have things figured out and then all of a sudden we do something right place, right time. And we really find our passion and what we want to do with our lives. And it sounded like from hearing you talk about it and from what you just said, that is exactly what happened.
Well, I'm also a big fan of sort of the winding road towards figuring out what you want to do. I've done a lot of different things. Right out of college, I worked in mutual funds. I've been a speechwriter for a U.S. Governor. I've worked helping assess kids for sexual and physical abuse. I've worked in juvenile court. So there's been so many cool things I've gotten to do. I was a researcher at one point for the Centers for Disease Control for pediatric HIV when that first was happening. And so but what's been so amazing about that trajectory is that every piece of that has given me some insight into what I do, what I love. And each one of those things was exciting when I first started, but then you sort of figure out what you're good at and what you want to do. And you finally piece it all together. And here I am getting to write at the very nexus of all the things I care about most, which is helping kids become their best, truest selves and helping them develop their voice and helping education be as good as it can be, and writing a lot about child welfare and juvenile justice, so that, all of those pieces have been so worthwhile because they all, I never practiced law, but I still write about juvenile justice all the time. So I love that. I'm a huge fan of David Epstein's book Range for that reason, in the sense that I think, I'd love to shift over from the word dilettante to the word sort of, for having a wide range of interests and knowledge that feed each other.
Yeah. And an interesting thing that you said in your keynote was that you still finished law school. I specifically remember you saying that you started it so you wanted to finish it. And in my head, there's people that have different takes on that. Like, should we finish things we start, or, everybody has a different take. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then also the same thing with kids too. Like when do you finish something that you started versus maybe reconsider and think, okay, maybe this isn't something that I should finish. It's kind of a broad question, but.
No, I get that question a lot, the whole letting kids quit thing. I think it's a sort of a different question when you talk about law school, because at that point, I was really fortunate at that point. We did have to move. And so I had to go visit at another school in order to finish at University of North Carolina. They were really supportive in that. I love school. I mean, I love the exercise of, especially law school, because law school teaches, I'm not the natural sort of thinker that one would point out and say, oh yeah, you should go to law school. I'm not a really sort of or I wasn't anyway, a really linear process-based thinker. I'm one of those people who, would raise my hand in class and open my mouth and just hope something that made sense came out. Whereas law school really helped me. There are so many writers that I respect and love their process, especially as journalists who have been lawyers. Actually, my former editor at the New York Times was one. Some of my favorite writers right now actually were former lawyers, mainly because it allows you to really think along a trajectory and come up with, the devil's advocate, sort of both sides of it, and come up with a really great argument for your point. So, that was all really worth it for me. And at that point, once you get to the point where you've only got, I think I had 3 semesters left at that point, and I was able to finish them doing, a bunch of creative cobbling. And, once I had my kid, and it was just fun for me. It was learning for me as play, and it's hard sometimes. I mean, I had to take a lot of classes and stuff that was really difficult for me, but I love that challenge. That's one of my favorite. I probably would just be in school. And I guess that's what I'm doing. I mean, honestly, as I write these books, I was interested in the topics behind gift of failure. I became interested in substance abuse, both through my own recovery and through the fact that I was teaching in a drug and alcohol rehab for kids. And so the addiction inoculation came out of that. So essentially, I find these things that I'm really fascinated in. I get to read everything in that topic. Sort of break it all down, find the landscape in my head, and find a way to translate it for people who don't want to do all the technical reading. It's like this incredible place of being just a big research geek and a translator and a writer. I love it. It's the perfect job for me.
Yeah, and it's so true. Is all the time and effort that you or anybody has that's done well with a book that has put into it. Books can take a long time to read, but when you think about it, you're able to cram years of research
Yeah.
into this book and then kind of consolidate it and organize it for people, which actually saves them a lot of time to learn deeply about a topic from the work that you put in or another author put in.
Well, and that's also a place of trust, because in order to be a good source of information for you, the reader, I have to do all of my due diligence. And it helps that I'm married to a statistician. So every once in a while I'll sit down with a study and I'll say, I really want to mention this study, but it just seems a little shaky to me. And I can go to him, show him this study, and he'll say, oh, you can't talk about that one because look at these confounding issues, blah, blah, blah. But we were talking about this before we went live, is that the process of writing a nonfiction book, for me anyway, to do it the way I feel I have to do it to have it be really good and to be solid on from a research perspective, is, this last book, the substance abuse book, the addiction Innoculation, it took me a whole year to write the proposal before that even went to my editor. And that was because for me to even get my arms around the topic, took me a full year. And then I start the writing process, and that process takes a year and a half. And then the editing, all that other stuff that comes after. So I started this book, I got the idea for this book about 4 years ago, and have been whittling away at it ever since. And so it'll be out in April. It was supposed to come out this fall, but we decided the election season would not be the best time to release any book right now. So I'm really glad it's coming out in April. But that's, like I said, that process is really special to me. It's a huge place of privilege for you to open a book and then, find something that is interesting to you and quote it, because that means you have faith in me that I have done my work well and have fact checked every single angle on it. So it's a lot of pressure, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And your website, jessicalahey.com, and last name is Lahey. People can buy either of your books there. And then you've got links to where they can get them on Amazon. So check out Jessica's website if you want to look at either of her books. So I talked about it a little bit earlier. Right now, a lot of people are in this situation we've never been in before, where one, I think we're starting to appreciate teachers a lot more than ever before, probably because we've been thrust into this role where we're almost like part-time teachers as well, or trying to help out. My son started school 2 weeks ago or last week. He's in kindergarten, and he's doing the first 9 weeks virtually, and then the plan would be for him to go back to school. And so my wife and I find ourselves, we switch off depending on who's working, sitting there, and we've got to be there to help them get logged into class and then listen to what the assignments are. And I've read your book, and I've read reviewed notes and taken notes, and I'm all about letting not only kids, but people fail and learn from their failures and stuff. But I still find it really, really hard to know when my kid has an assignment and homework, because I'm not a teacher. How do I help him without crippling him and giving him the learned dependency? So would love to kind of frame the discussion about raising resilient kids and letting kids fail around sort of our current environment of, we're in this position where we're like teaching them.
Thank goodness I did not have to write that book mid-pandemic. I mean, it's a completely different thing. The other thing I had to do with writing that book is there's a lot of stuff we do in education to begin with that is a disaster for learning, but I couldn't, write The Gift of Failure and say, hi, in my fantasy world where everything is fantastic, where we don't give a lot of homework and where we don't do these big summative exams, here's how to handle that fantasy world of mine. Well, that's not very helpful. So I had to sort of go at it from the perspective of here's where we are. And, I think right now is a really difficult time, mainly because let me flip it on its head. When I get to, usually when we're in a non-COVID situation, I'm usually on the road for a huge chunk of the year doing professional development for teachers, working in schools, talking to kids, talking to parents. And I can tell you right now that when I talk to teachers, they're often amazed by how hard it is to take the tools we have as teachers that we know work for learning, that are evidence-based tools, great for learning, and use those with our own kids. So like there's a wall in our brain and it's hard for us to see both sides. And that's under normal circumstances. And that's with some self-awareness of, oh, I do know all this really good stuff, and yet why is it so hard for me to use it? Now flip that on its head, and suddenly you have parents who don't have training in all of that stuff that we know works for kids, and being asked to somehow be good at that too. It's an impossible situation. So I think the best advice I can give parents right now is to sort of envision the teacher that you learned the most from. And it probably was not a teacher who, when you raised your hand or when you felt stuck, just gave you the answer, right? Because that's terrible teaching, and it's terrible for learning. What works really, really well for learning is helping guide kids toward their own discovery of the answer. And especially when a task is slightly just a hair beyond the ability level of the kids. So that's why, we leave a math teacher, for example, might leave the most challenging problems for the end of the problem set because they want to stretch you at the end. The most learning happens in those stretch moments. So as a parent, if you can just remember that, this thing called desirable difficulties, which is learning something that's just a little difficult for you to parse and get in your head, that's good. Desirable difficulties are really great for learning. That handing our kids don't just like upload, it's not like we can download what's in our brain and that they'll just suck it up and suddenly it's there. That's not how learning works. So the more we can sort of step back and lead kids in the direction of figuring out the answer for themselves, the better. It's not going to be our job to, reteach all of Algebra 1 because they can't figure this one algebra problem out. It is good for us to go maybe look at a problem that they did do well and say, okay, well, let's look at what you did on number 4. Why are you not replicating that same process here with problem 2? Or what's different about problem 2 and from problem 4 that means you'd have to change your approach? That kind of reflection back. Sometimes all they need, honestly, often what'll happen is a kid will raise their hand and they're like, Mrs. Lahey, I can't do it, I'm stuck. And our job at that point is honestly just to stand there and have them tell us what they think the problem is, what they think the issue is, what they think the question means, to read the directions again, reflect to us what they think they're supposed to do. And I'm going to tell you 8 times out of 10, they're going to say, oh, never mind, I just figured it out myself. So being more of a silent sort of place for someone to just voice what they think they're supposed to do, someone who can look with fresh eyes at what they've done and maybe how they can alter what they're doing based on what they've done in other spots. But often, we want to just fix it because that's easier and it's faster and it makes our kids stop saying, I'm so dumb, I don't know what to do. And, if we can just make them stop that, then they can feel good and smart about themselves and have good self-esteem. But unfortunately, that's not how self-esteem works. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I've found, my wife and I have found ourselves talking to each other about this, and we know it's the wrong way to look at it, but we do it anyways, right? And I would just love to hear your opinion on this. So we see our son's work and we submit it, we take pictures of it and you submit it. And I think eventually we're going to get some type of feedback or grades back from the teachers. But a couple of times we said, well, I wonder how this compares to what the other kids are doing. And I know that is the wrong way to look at it, but it's that temptation is there. So I guess A, is that the wrong way to look at it? And you won't hurt my feelings if you tell me yes. And then B, what would the right approach to that be? Because we want our kids to succeed, right?
Right. Okay. So first of all, how the other kids are doing on it for your purposes is totally irrelevant, because so there are a few things we know work really well for teaching. And one of them is this thing called formative assessments. And formative assessments are every day some sort of low stakes assessment to figure out where the kid is in the learning. And if you think about it, these assignments are homework in its most ideal form, if there is such a thing. That's what those are, right? So your kid doing things to the best of their ability and being in charge of articulating back to the teacher what they don't understand, that's the best and highest use of an assignment or a homework assignment or whatever that thing is that you're handing back in. And just so you know, by the way, homework or assignments like you're talking about when you said hopefully it'll get some feedback on it, research is really clear that if your kid doesn't, and when I say you, I mean your kid, not you, your kid. If your kid does not get feedback on that assignment, it is not a very useful assignment. It's not much better than a waste of their time. The feedback matters a lot. So, and what that feedback looked like and all that sort of stuff. So from your perspective, honestly, the best possible thing is that you have no idea how all the other kids are doing, because it is irrelevant for your kid, unless, of course, unless your kid has some major learning disability and needs to be assessed and isn't being assessed. That's a massive issue too. But I'm assuming, since you didn't mention it, that that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, where my kid is. And your need to understand that is natural, because given that we don't get report cards on our parenting, the next best thing as a parent is to see a report card on their performance, right? So that we can co-opt that as some evidence of our success or failure. But if you turn that on its head again, and I need to stop using that phrase, if you think about it, that doing that to your kid is super unfair, because they are not an extension of your parenting. They're their own person. And if you're co-opting their successes and failures as your own, it's not only unfair to you, it's unfair to them. So stop doing that. And if they were in my classroom and they do that thing where they start comparing notes, like, "Ooh, how'd you do? Ooh, how'd you do?" Yeah. All that does is foment competition, which for some kids is great, but for a lot of kids is a really negative factor on performance. That adding competition in, actually, for many kids can lower their performance, because mastery and speed, or mastery and, mastery of a concept doesn't have a lot to do, number one, with how everyone else is doing, and it doesn't have anything to do with like how fast they can do it, that kind of thing. So yeah, shouldn't matter to you.
Yes. That's what we thought. It's hard though. These things are hard. But that's
and if you're unsure of if you really need to know, in a couple of weeks, go to the teacher and say, it's really weird to not have a sense of where my kid is, but I'm assuming your kid's pretty young, because you're saying you have to sit there with them when they do this stuff. At this point, really, I have to say, until high school, and even then, I don't think it matters. It really is irrelevant to you where your kid is relative to other kids, unless the teacher is worried that there's a problem.
So staying on the topic of school, and you've written about this, and I've heard you talk about it, but getting kids excited for school.
So getting kids excited for school requires that you get them excited on an intrinsic level, that you're getting their sort of, when you watch your kid and they're doing something like Minecraft or Legos or whatever, reading something that they're really, really into, and they're not doing it for a grade. In fact, if you were to assign that same book, they probably would be like, "I don't want to read that, forget it." But if it's something of their own choosing, they're going to be a lot more likely to be invested for the sake of the thing itself. And so the analogy I give is, if it's really cold outside and you have a toddler, you don't say to your kid, "Do you want to wear a hat?" You give them limited choices within the framework of, it's kind of important to wear a hat today. So would you like to wear the red hat or the blue hat? And that gives them some buy-in, and that also allows them to feel like they have a little bit of control. And anyone who's ever been around a toddler knows that that lack of control is what makes them often insufferable, because they have control over nothing, and yet they want control over everything. So the more control we can give them over the small things, the more likely we're going to be to get buy-in. The one thing to remember is that if you want to undermine their excitement and enthusiasm for something, it's through those extrinsic motivators, whether that's paying kids for grades, whether that's sticker charts, whether that's punishing kids for not having a high enough GPA, whether that's surveillance, watching them on their phones, whether that's surveillance going on the portal and looking at their grades all the time. All of those things are extrinsic motivators, and they work really well in the short term, and they're a disaster over the long term. And that's not me. That's 40 years of really good research. Go read Edward Dici's Why We Do What We Do, The Science of Self-Motivation. Go listen to Dan Pink's TED Talk. Go read Martin Seligman's work in positive psychology. All that research, 40 years of research, shows that extrinsic motivators, trying to get kids by dangling a carrot and stick, does not work over the long term. If you want your kids to not want to learn math, pay them for their math grades. It's pretty clear. So intrinsic motivation, that's where it is. That's where the good stuff is.
I think you said extrinsic motivation destroys confidence and creativity, or maybe it was competence and creativity.
Yeah, extrinsic motivators, it destroys it. What it does is it whittles away at kids' motivation to do something over the long term. And it also is really destructive to creativity. In Edward Dici's book, he talks about a couple of different studies where they looked at creative output in kids and adults who were being rewarded for their creative output, or in some sort of competition, or some control had been placed over their creative output, and it undermines creativity. So those music and and art teachers that have to use grades, they're in a really difficult place, because if the very way they evaluate creative output undermines creative output, they're in a horrible catch-22.
Yeah. And so what, do you have an example of a way, instead of doing something like a sticker chart, which is something we've commonly seen as ways to try to help our kids stay in their rooms at night or sleep or whatever, instead of using that, what's a good way to get them intrinsically motivated?
So, you got to take apart what's on the sticker chart. I mean, because the approach is different based on what it is. If it's household duties, if it's first of all, no paying kids for doing stuff around the house. That we had talked very briefly before we went on air about books around finance and kids and teaching kids about money. Ron Lieber, who is the Your Money columnist for the New York Times, his book, The Opposite of Spoiled, is magnificent. It is such a great book about that intersection between finance and money and budgeting, teaching kids about personal finance, and the intrinsic, extrinsic motivation stuff, and how to get kids really engaged. So if it's about something like household duties, the attitude should be that we all do these things because we're all part of the family. And the research there is that kids actually, especially during times like this COVID pandemic, kids who have a hand in keeping the family running, whether that's just putting their dishes in the dishwasher if they're a really little kid, or keeping their room clean if that's something that matters to you, or just doing little things around the house, kids who feel like they have been playing a part in keeping the household running actually suffer fewer mental health issues, negative mental health effects from the bad stuff that happens, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a divorce, whether it's a death in the family, whatever that thing is. So there's a couple of different research studies on that. So coming at it from that attitude of, what would you like your job to be? And here's what your job, and if whatever that thing is, it's going to be your job for the next 6 months or 3 months or whatever. So there's ways to go at that. There is an exception, by the way, while we're talking sticker charts. The exception, so sticker charts don't work for the long term. They seem like they work. They're so sneaky because they really do work in the short term. And they're a great way to boost, like extrinsic motivators are a great way to boost motivation for the short term, or like as a one-off, they're great. The one exception to that rule, though, is potty training, because potty training does have its own intrinsic reward, which is not wearing diapers anymore, wearing big kid pants, whatever that thing is. That does have its own reward at the end. So, you sticker chart away for
that.
Training,
Yeah, sometimes there's
that's what you want. Yeah, but getting kids interested in doing the thing for the sake of the thing itself, which means you might have to give them more choice on the front end. And intrinsic motivation comes from giving them more choice or autonomy. So how they do it, in what order they do it, if you feel really, really strongly that dishes should be oriented north-south and you're doing it east, they're doing it east-west, maybe just cut them a break. Number 2, helping them feel competent, which means that they can do it. Even if things go wrong, they're going to be able to figure out ways to do it, and that they feel connected to you, that you're supporting them even if they do it wrong. So those 3 things are sort of what get kids invested. And in the book, like, I'm giving you big picture stuff here, but in the book, there's like lists of tips, like here's all the things you can expect a 6-year-old to be able to do around the house, and here's some strategies to how to get them to do it. And that was the really fun part, was breaking down what kids really can do, and our expectations tend to be so low for them. It's really crazy.
Yeah, that was one of the things I think like my biggest takeaways is that we underestimate or
Yeah.
undermine our kids.
Yeah.
We don't think that we don't give enough credit for what they can actually achieve, and it's like we limit them for almost our own selfish reasons or whatever,
Yeah.
and so they can do a lot more than we give them credit for.
And it's
So
just faster if we do it, right? And it's just easier if we do it. But someone sent me a video once that was one of my favorite things that I've ever gotten in the mail. And it was a little boy who wanted to help with the laundry. He wanted to help so desperately. And so he was like he wasn't quite a toddler. He was bigger than a toddler, but his toddler little sister was nearby. And so he was reaching in. It was a top loading washer. Don't worry. There was an adult right there. It was very safe. And he told his little sister, he said, I'm going to crawl in here with the top of my body. And if I can't get out, you have to pull on my legs to help me get out. And so he would fish around in there and get the wet clothes. And he's like, pull me out. And his little toddler sister would pull on his leg and help pull him back out of the washing machine. And then he'd put the thing in the dryer. It was one of the coolest things because you would have looked at that kid and said, first of all, he can't reach up there on his own. There's no way these two little kids are going to do it. And they did it. They figured out a way to do it on their own. It was so cool.
So this is a good segue. You said it's faster if we do it ourselves, right? You shared a story in in the 2019 keynote, and we'll link to this in the show notes about how your son was too embarrassed at one point to tie his shoes in school, which caused him to skip PT. PT or am I
phys ed, PE,
physical? I call it PT from the military. Physical education, PE. I'm sorry, PE. Yeah. There we go. I got mixed up there, and I was like, wait a second, that's not right. Can you share that story, because I find myself also doing this.
It actually, there's even more to the story that's in the book, because it sort of led to some really cool things that happened after the book came out. So Finn was 9 at the time, and we lived in New Hampshire at the time, and which will come up and be relevant in a moment. And so I got a note. He was going to the same school where I taught, which is good in some ways and horrifying for him in other ways. And so I found out that he was not able to go to PE. He was having to sit it out because he was wearing his brother's like big tall boots and didn't have sneakers. But I knew he had sneakers because I had bought them. It turns out that the sneakers that he had laces in them, and he'd lost his Velcro sneakers, and he couldn't use the sneakers with the laces because he had never revealed this to me. I guess I'd never thought about it. He didn't know how to tie his own shoes. And at that point, he's old enough that it's embarrassing. He doesn't want anyone to know. He doesn't want to tell me why he can't wear the sneakers. And it was a whole thing. And, that sneaker thing came at a really opportune moment, because I was really angry at the parents of my students for just doing too much for their kids. And I was on a very high horse, at that time. And so it was a really good moment for sort of to realize that this is what I'm doing too. And so that's what sort of led to this book. And, various things were coming up that I realized he was going to have to be a lot more competent than I had allowed him to be. And, that was that moment of humility where I said, I can't really be angry at the parents of my students for over-parenting, because I'm doing the exact same thing for my own kid. And that's when it really became urgent for me that I had to figure out not only how overparenting contributes to learned helplessness, and but not only that, how it contributes to learning. Like, are we really messing kids' learning up when we overparent? And it turns out, yes, we are. And I just split an infinitive. Anyway, but it turns out that we are really messing around with kids' ability to learn when we do too much for them. And there's really great research on that as well. It turns out that the most powerful teaching tools I have as a teacher work best for kids who are capable of feeling a little bit frustrated and sort of sitting with that feeling for a little bit. And kids that can't, who are typically kids that tend to be overparented, are much more likely to give up and just abandon the effort of a difficult task right off the bat. So the research, putting all that research together, is sort of the fun part of writing a book like this, is tying the pieces, to overdo the metaphor of the shoe tying, tying all the pieces together and allowing someone to see a big picture of how the research actually applies to our own kids' learning.
Aside from and maybe this is how we learn and realize this, but without something like that happening, if we don't have that happen, what are some signs that I can look, and I'll just put it in my own terms, that I can look for in my son or our daughter that that might indicate that we're over parenting? Like, is there anything to just look for? Is it like kids give up early on stuff, or is that?
Yeah, so it turns out when what's over parenting, let's use a more technical term. If you're if you're overly directive, which means like you tell your kid, okay, now do this. Okay, now do this. And don't give them that moment to sort of think for themselves about what the next step might be. That overly directive parenting tends to lead to kids just being really quick to give up, really quick to sort of throw their hands up in the air and say, that's it, I'm never ever going to tie my shoes ever, because there's no way I can do it, I'm too dumb, blah blah blah. It also leads to really heightened anxiety. And there's a whole bunch of really great writers writing right now, Lisa D'Amour and Julie Lythcott-Haims, and a whole bunch of wonderful writers talking about how much anxiety we're currently seeing in kids, and it's really through the roof. And a lot of that anxiety comes from this need to be perfect, that if you can't do it perfectly the first time you try, then you're stupid, or then it's just too hard for you. And that overly anxious thing, and the sort of the tendency to give up really quickly, all of that can be fixed actually fairly easily if you're willing to pay a lot more attention to the process of learning, and drag your attention away from the end product, drag your attention away from needing to know what the grade is on everything and how everyone else is doing, because our kids right now don't really believe us when we say, oh, the grade doesn't matter, all I care about is the learning, because what we're showing them is, what I really care about is that grade. So if we can focus more on the process and less on the product, we can lower anxiety, we can lower competition, we can also help kids just feel more comfortable with frustration, and therefore help them feel more competent through learning, with their learning.
One of the things we like to talk about is just the idea of getting our kids interested in finance and investing. And so you mentioned the book, Opposite of Spoiled, but do you have just a few ways? One of the challenging things with money is it's a boring topic, right? So it's hard to.
No one teaches it. No one teaches it to children. It's bananas. Like, believe me, I'm out there advocating for personal finance. In fact, my kid is this year enrolled in both personal finance and business ethics, which we're super excited about. Ron Lieber and I talk about this all the time. Oh my gosh, where are they going to learn personal finance if not in school or from us? So I'm so glad you're talking about this.
Yeah. Well, how do we keep kids, and we'll go with probably, I don't know, middle school to high school aged kids. How do we start to have those discussions with them and not just completely lose them? Maybe just a couple ways.
I mean, the basic stuff is, number one, no paying for chores, or I call them household duties, because who wants to do something called a chore? It just sounds terrible. But allowance is very much a part of teaching kids about money, right? And if you read, there's a fantastic book. So not only is Ron Lieber's book wonderful and really outlines for you how exactly you do that, how you help kids get a budget. He has great sections in there on like back to school clothes buying, which things are wants and which things are needs, and how do you budget for the wants as opposed to the needs. And it's the front of the book. I'm not sure if the paperback still does, but it has the 3 jars, the spend, save, and give, and that stuff's all important too. But understanding that we give kids an allowance because they need a place to learn about money, and they need to learn about, generosity, and they need to learn about, how they manage that money. And that's really, really important. But that's not tied to contributions around the house. Often in our house, actually, if kids really want to save up for something, I'll come up with, I can come up with jobs, extra and above jobs that they're in charge of, and they can earn extra money for things like that. But the basic stuff is what you do as part of a family. So I recommend Ron's book. There's also another book by a woman named Vicki Hoefle, Hoefle, called Duct Tape Parenting. She's hardline, because her rule is every year after age 12, they get a weekly allowance Okay, I'm sorry, up until 12. They get a weekly allowance that's the dollars for the number of years they are. So a 6-year-old gets $6 a week, blah, 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 up to age 12, at which point you start cutting it in half, because kids should be able to get little, find little jobs to do and stuff like that. And I will say it is much harder for kids to get jobs now. My 16-year-old has, when he first went out looking for jobs, it was really, really hard. So, because there's such, due to liability stuff, like, one place said, we'd love to hire you, but you can't even run the vacuum cleaner because that's seen as a piece of machinery. I mean, it was just bonkers. But her hard line is really, and then when they get a car, they have to pay for it themselves. They have to pay for their insurance themselves. I think all of those things, there's somewhere in there is your sweet spot as a family, whether it's Vicky Hofla's side or it's, all the way over to Ron Lieber's and my side, which is a combination of the two. My 21-year-old is in college and he pays for certain aspects of his life. And the nice thing about that is those things mean a lot more to him because he has a job and he's earning money, and that's his money to either save or use accordingly. So, using the budgeting stuff for the financial discussions. And I remember at one point, I think he was like 18 at the time or 17 at the time, we were talking about investing for retirement, and I was explaining compound interest to him because, teenage years are a great time to explain compound interest. And I did the classic example of, here's what it looks like if you save, $10 a week now versus $10 a week when you're 30. And my son looked at me and he said, how are people supposed to learn this stuff? And I said, this conversation right here. And that's only because I know the tiniest bit about it. We really need to be teaching personal finance in school. And I find it horrifying that we don't. So I'm constantly lobbying for that.
Okay. So we'll link to those books, Duct Tape Parenting and The Opposite of Spoiled. Okay.
Yeah.
I've got one last question for you. And I didn't prep you for this, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot here.
Okay. Hit me.
What's something that you've changed your mind about lately?
Oh, a lot of things. So as a journalist, there's a lot of learning I've had to do on the national stage, which is, my thinking has evolved over a long period of time around homework, around dress codes. Dress codes is the big one. I worked at a school for a long time that had dress codes, and I was so invested in that school policy and being a member of that team that I was overlooking how it was affecting especially the girls that I was having to enforce the dress code with. So I actually have written an entire piece on why I enforce middle school dress codes. And it's a piece that I wish I could make go away, but I can't. I mean, the publication I wrote it for would have to issue like a retraction or something. But when you're doing your learning on a national stage like that, I did a big 180 on homework, most homework, dress codes, school time starts. The American Academy of Pediatrics says that school shouldn't start any earlier than 8:30 for teenagers because of sleep phase delay. There's a whole bunch of stuff I've changed my mind on. And that's the best part of being in a position where I can say here publicly, yeah, I had this one opinion and then I learned some more stuff and my opinion has evolved. And that's the very thing I'm asking my children to do, which is to not be ashamed and deny the fact that they ever had that opinion at one point. It's to say, look, I took this learning and I used it to have now a more evolved opinion. Isn't that a good thing? And that's what we should be modeling for our kids all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great answer. And I think a great place to end. So Jessica, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking. I enjoy following you. I didn't mention this, but you are the co-host of a podcast. So if anybody wants to find you on the internet, you can go, it's the #AmWriting podcast.
All things writing. Yeah. It's my co-hosts are actually my former New York Times editor and best-selling romance author, Serena Bowen. We have a lot of fun over there.
You had the author of, it's totally slipped my mind, but she became a poker player.
Oh, Maria Konnikova. It's called The Biggest Bluff. And Maria Konnikova was a former staff writer for the New Yorker, and she took leave in order to become a professional poker player. And she became so good that suddenly she had this book like 3/4 written, but she couldn't just get it out there because like she hadn't realized just how good she was going to get. So yeah, it's a fantastic book. It's a wonderful book.
Yeah. And a bunch of other good talks. And so, again, we can find Jessica at jessicalahey.com. Her books, The Gift of Failure, and coming out April 2021, The Addiction Innoculation. I'm excited for that. I think that's definitely a series of topics that's more important now probably than ever before. So I can't wait.
By the way, all the books I've mentioned, if you go to jessicalahey.com under speaking, there's a big button that says download speaking bibliography. And it's like 3 or 4 pages of just my greatest hits, stuff that I recommend the most on a whole variety of topics. So any of the books I've mentioned will definitely be there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate your time.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
Of course. And we're here to empower you to invest in your future. Thanks for listening, everybody.